Welcome to Lecture 16. Today we're going to be talking about Thomas Szasz' article, The Myth of Mental Illness. This is one of the harder readings we're going to encounter in the course just because it's very opaque. The writing is extremely unclear, and a lot of what I'm doing today is going to be basically trying to reconstruct as best I can what exactly it is that Szasz is saying in the article. You might be wondering, if the article is sort of that cryptic and dense, why are we even reading it? Why, spend our time on a really hard article when we could pick an easier article? And the reason why is that Szasz is the arch moral skeptic or anti-realist. He was really kind of the main advocate of this way of thinking in the 20th century, and so his arguments have been very influential. And so because of that, he's the guy to read on this topic, because he's kind of the root of this particular brand of thought. So what kind of anti-realism? What exactly is Szasz saying? Well, to understand this, we need to go back to the difference between the neurological disorder theory and the imperfect rationality theory. The neurological disorder theory says that all mental illnesses are a subspecies of brain illness, and as such, mental illnesses always involve neurological malfunctions. So, for instance, there might be a breakdown in, say, normal serotonin release and reuptake. The imperfect rationality theory, on the other hand, says that mental illnesses are distinct from brain illnesses because mental illnesses involve, among other things at least, mental or psychological malfunctions. And so one kind of thing that it might involve is the inability to, update one's belief that the FBI is investigating you, even though there's no evidence that in fact the FBI is investigating you. Persecutorial delusions are a kind of classic example of mental illness. Now, Szasz is not trying to argue that there are no neurological disorders, and he's not trying to argue that there cannot be patterns of behavior that arise from neurological disorders and that look like a lot of the sorts of symptoms that we tend to associate with mental illnesses. So Szasz isn't going to have any problem accepting the existence of Parkinson's disease, even though advanced Parkinsonism can bear superficial similarities to depression in terms of the kind of symptoms exhibited. Now, what Szasz is going to want to say is that insofar as a certain mental illness, let's just say addiction, for instance, can be understood as a neurological disorder, then Szasz is going to be fine with accepting the existence of those illnesses, but what he's going to insist is that they're not mental illnesses in that case, they're neurological illnesses. Szasz is basically going to say, look, if you can give me a neurological basis for talking about the illness, then I'm fine with saying that it exists. But in that case, insofar as you're specifying a neurological basis for the illness, it's not a mental illness, it's a neurological illness. And so, like metaphysical and moral skeptics and anti-realists more generally, Szasz wants to argue that there are no mental illnesses that are distinct from neurological illnesses. And so one way you can kind of look at what Szasz and the moral and metaphysical skeptics and anti-realists more generally are arguing for is that basically the imperfect rationality theory is sort of the right way to understand what a mental illness would be if it existed, but they simply deny that there are any such things as mental illnesses understood in terms of the imperfect rationality theory. So basically, just to kind of sum up there, they sort of think that defenders of the neurological disorder theory of mental illness are getting it wrong because they don't think that our sort of concept of mental illness can be reduced to neurological disorders, or our concept of neurological disorders, but they think that even though the concept of mental illness is distinct from and can't be reduced to our concept of neurological illnesses, they think that in fact there just is no such thing as a mental illness as distinct from a neurological disorder. Okay, so in the paper, Szasz kind of makes three interrelated arguments. And the first argument that Szasz makes is sort of that if the imperfect rationality theory is correct, then neurology will never be relevant to explaining mental illnesses and their symptoms. And his argument is basically that the sorts of paradigmatic symptoms of mental illnesses, for instance, having false beliefs that just don't respond to evidence, like Cotard delusion, cannot ever be explained neurologically, in the same way that, say, visual defects could be explained by lesions to primary visual cortex. So, for instance, if an individual has a stroke in primary visual cortex in the right hemisphere, which would be kind of right in the back of your head right there, then what will happen is they'll actually go blind in their left hemifield, which is the left half of their visual field. So basically everything from kind of the midline of their face over, they won't be able to see. They'll only be able to see things on the right side. And that's just because basically the part of the brain responsible for processing inputs from the left half of each of the eyes it's no longer working basically because of a stroke or a lesion or what have you. Now, there's a problem with Zaz's argument here, though, that if the imperfect rationality theory is right, then neurology will never be relevant to explaining mental illnesses and their symptoms. And the reason why is that actually both the neurological disorder theory and the imperfect rationality theory claim that sometimes neurology is relevant to explaining mental illness symptoms. Where they disagree is whether or not talking about neurology is sort of all there is to talking about mental illnesses. So the neurological disorder theory is going to say that to explain a mental illness, you just start talking about neurological disorder and you're done. Whereas the imperfect rationality theorist is going to say, well, we may need to talk about neurology in order to explain mental illnesses, but once we're done talking about all the neurology, we're still going to have to do some explaining in terms of the mental states of the subject. So for instance, in the case of depression, they might say part of the cause of depression is that there's an imbalance in the amount of release and reuptake of serotonin in the brain. But on top of that, part of what's causally driving the mental illness is that the depressed person has a very low opinion of themselves and of their life's work, as we saw with the example of Virginia Woolf. Okay, now it looks like we actually have some reason to disagree with Zaz's argument. And so I'm going to basically lay out sort of a criticism of Zaz's first argument. And it appeals to the idea in cognitive science that the brain is a kind of computer or information processor. And this is something that we saw particularly clearly articulated by Zenon Ploshin. And so the idea is that, well, if beliefs or program states of the mind, they're not going to be identical to any given state of the brain or of the hardware. And the reason why is that if we think of a belief as sort of akin to the state of a given computer program, then a computer program can be run on multiple different kinds of hardware. And so as a result, the belief, my belief that water is H2O may be realized by a certain state of my neurons, but of course if there's intelligent alien life, then they may not even have neurons, but they may still be capable of having the belief that water is made of H2O. And similarly, if humans ever manage to crack AI and were able to design androids like Data from Star Trek, then Data can believe that water is made of H2O, but of course Data doesn't have any neurons, he's just got silicon circuits. And so in these cases you would have one and the same belief, namely that water is made of H2O, being realized by neurology and whatever kind of organic states Martian brains might have, and silicone chips in the case of AI. And so basically Zaz is right that beliefs are not identical to neurological states. Where he goes wrong is thinking that entails that neurology will never be relevant to explaining mental illnesses if, in fact, mental illnesses are distinct from neurological disorders. And so here, to see this, we can go back to what Ploshin had to say about computational architecture and the implementation of a program on a piece of hardware. So basically what Ploshin tried to argue is that the total behavior of an information processor or a computer is going to be determined both by the kind of program that the hardware is running, as well as features of the hardware itself. And that a lot of the job of cognitive science is sort of trying to figure out what aspects of human behavior are sort of due to the program that our brains are running, and what aspects are due to the hardware of the brain itself. And Ploshin gave us a really simple example of a calculator. And so you may have a calculator that always rounds after the first 8 digits when performing a calculation. And the way that you explain why it rounds isn't because, let's say, when I sit down and I type certain numbers in, it's trying to calculate pi. The explanation of why it always rounds after 8 digits is that the register is of a finite size. It only has so much memory capacity, and so it just has to round after the first 8 digits. And so in order to explain the behavior of the calculator, why when I enter in certain functions or when I enter in certain inputs, the calculator basically gives me back a certain number that's the rounded first 8 digits of pi. In order to explain that, I have to talk about both what the program that the calculator is running, namely it's trying to calculate the digits of pi, but I also have to talk about the hardware. Namely, I have to talk about the fact that it only has so much memory, and that's why it gets rounded after 8 digits and not, say, 10 or 12 or 20. And similarly, if mental illnesses are in fact distinct from neurological disorders because mental states are akin to computer programs, then again, there'll be certain aspects of mental illnesses that are going to be explained by sort of the programming, but there'll also be certain aspects that are explained in terms of the hardware. And so Zaz is sort of mistaken insofar as he seems to think that neurology and talking about neurology would be totally irrelevant to explaining mental illnesses and their symptoms if the imperfect rationality theory is correct. Instead, it looks like if the imperfect rationality theory is correct, then sometimes neurology may be relevant to explaining mental illness and the symptoms, but it won't always be relevant to explaining it. Zaz also argues directly against the neurological disorder theory of mental illness. And here what he says is the statement that X is a mental symptom involves rendering a judgment. The judgment entails, moreover, a covert comparison or matching of the patient's ideas, concepts, or beliefs with those of the observer and the society in which they live. The notion of mental symptom is therefore inextricably tied to the social, including ethical context in which it is made, in much the same way that the notion of a bodily symptom is tied to an anatomical or genetic context. So in other words, basically what Zaz is trying to claim here is that we simply can't understand what the symptoms of mental illnesses are without appealing to social and ethical norms. But we can understand neurological illnesses without appealing to those kinds of norms. And so as a result, Zaz wants to say, mental illnesses and neurological illnesses must be distinct because of how we conceive of them in different ways. Namely, when we start thinking about mental illnesses, we start thinking in terms of like social and ethical norms. But in order to think about neurological illnesses, you don't need to think about social or ethical norms. Well, Zaz certainly seems to be right that we can't understand mental illnesses except in terms of norms. But it's not so clear that the norms that we have to bring on board to think about mental illnesses are social and ethical norms. So again, go back to the computer analogy. If we think of the mind as a computer sort of designed by evolution or selected for by kind of the sorts of processes active in natural selection, then perhaps we can understand what the mind is supposed to be doing without having to appeal to social and cultural norms. We can just think about sort of what kinds of jobs was the mind designed to do by evolution. Okay, and by the way, we're going to talk a little bit more about different kinds of norms and how they relate to understanding moral realism and anti-realism about mental illness a little bit later on in the course. So finally, Zaz argues directly against the existence of mental illnesses understood as distinct from neurological disorders. And here the argument that he gives us is pretty much this. He says, there's social disharmony, and we reify this social disharmony in terms of mental illnesses. But in reality, the source of the social disharmony is not mental illness. It's the fact that we live in a world of complex and conflicting values. And so there are no mental illnesses. There are just sort of complex and conflicting values that we're all subject to. And what he says is, and this is a direct quote, mental illnesses as a deformity of the personality is then regarded as the cause of the human disharmony. It is implicit in this view that social intercourse between people is regarded as something inherently harmonious, its disturbance being due solely to the presence of mental illnesses in many people. And it's just far from obvious that this is actually a correct characterization of how defenders of the imperfect rationality theory conceive of mental illnesses. In other words, it looks like he's sort of mischaracterizing their view. And one way that we can see this is there's a lot of sort of social chaos and disharmony that's just caused from people being jealous or petty or vindictive or selfish or ignorant and things like that. And these are all considered personality defects. They're sort of issues with the individual. And we routinely explain social discord in terms of them. Why is there so much stress in the office? Why is the office not getting as much work done as it could be? And it's, you can start talking about how different members of the group are being jealous of one another, or petty, or vindictive, or what have you. But of course, we don't think of jealousy or pettiness or being vindictive or selfish as mental illnesses. We might think of these as vices, but we certainly don't think of them as mental illnesses. But because the way that Zaz characterizes mental illnesses, then it looks like Zaz's characterization would say that, in fact, these are mental illnesses, when it's pretty clear that they're not. And so it looks like really Zaz is kind of attacking a caricature of the realist's position, because nobody should claim that mental illness is the root of all disharmony in society. And realists about mental illness, like George Graham, they're not committed to the claim that mental illnesses are the root of all social discord, even that mental illnesses are kind of like a major contributor to social discord. Somebody like Graham could claim that, in fact, mental illnesses are a relatively minor contributor, that other things such as greed and jealousy are much bigger factors in kind of creating chaos in human interaction. Now, Zaz wants to claim that mental illnesses, as understood by the realist about mental illness, are understood as the kind of root of social discord. And Zaz says basically, this is obviously fallacious reasoning, for it makes the abstraction, mental illness, into a cause, even though this abstraction was created in the first place to serve only as a shorthand expression for certain types of human behavior. And basically what Zaz is claiming here is that the realist mistakes a description of certain sorts of behavior for the causes of that behavior. But it's not obvious that the concept of mental illness is merely a description of certain sorts of behavior. And the way that we can see this is just through an analogy. So let's say that I periodically hear a kind of metallic banging noise when I'm in my room. And I'm not sure what the cause of the noise is. And I just decide to name the cause of the noise, whatever it is, the noisemaker. And so I define the noisemaker, my concept of the noisemaker, as whatever it is that's causing that kind of metallic banging noise. And I start rooting around, and after a while I find out that actually what it is it's wind warping the walls of my air conditioning ducts. So wind kind of comes in through the air conditioning unit, and it exerts a positive pressure, and then the walls of the air conditioning ducts kind of pop out, and then when the pressure goes back down, they pop in, and that's what makes the banging noise. So here I've defined something, namely this concept, the noisemaker, in terms of a certain sort of role. It's whatever it is that's making this metallic banging noise. And then I have to do some kind of investigation to figure out exactly what it is that is playing that role, namely, what is the noisemaker? And as it turns out, the noisemaker in this case is the wind causing my air conditioning ducts to warp. But there's nothing problematic with saying that the noisemaker is causing the noise, even though I defined it solely in terms of sort of what it's doing. And so as a result, the point that I'm kind of trying to illustrate with this example is that there's not necessarily anything problematic with defining mental illness in terms of a certain sort of pattern of behavior, and then identifying the mental illness with whatever it is that causes that behavior, just like we did in the case of the noisemaker. And it's important to notice that we had to do a little bit of theorizing and a little bit of investigation to identify the noisemaker as kind of wind deforming my air conditioning ducts. And so it could be that we might sort of get it wrong when we try to identify what in fact it is that causes some set of effects. So for instance, people used to think that witches were a cause of certain kinds of illness and misfortune. And it turns out that they got it wrong. They just had a bad theory of what caused illness and kind of misfortune. And later on, people realized that, what's causing these illnesses are bacteria and viruses, or, cancer, things like that. And so it might turn out that, as a matter of fact, there are no such things as mental illnesses as we conceive of them, just like it turns out that there are no such things as witches. But we had to do some science to realize that, in fact, it was viruses and bacteria that caused illness and not witchcraft. And so if Zaz is claiming that basically science shows us that there's no such thing as mental illness, because in fact we can explain everybody's behavior in terms of neurology and not in terms of mental states, then he's basically making an argument akin to what the metaphysical skeptic or anti-realist about mental illness made. And he's no longer making the kind of moral claim that we can sort of only understand mental illness in terms of social and ethical norms. But of course, once we make that move, the moral anti-realist is going to claim they're distinct from somatic illnesses, and therefore we have no reason to believe in them. And so it looks like what Zaz wants to claim is that there's no such thing as mental illness, because mental illnesses can only be defined in terms of social and ethical norms. But it's also far from obvious that that's correct, because, for instance, we might understand the kinds of norms that govern mental states in terms of evolutionary biology. And even if Zaz is correct that we can only understand mental illnesses in terms of social and ethical norms, someone could also argue that, in fact, we also have to understand somatic illnesses, things like cancer and broken bones, in terms of ethical and social norms. And in fact, as we're going to see a little bit later on, that's exactly what George Graham argues. All right, that's the lecture. Thank you very much.